But staying with the topic around Child Protection Week and also perhaps looking at where we are when corporal punishment is concerned, we've got Swedish Ambassador to SA Cecilia Julin, who's been very active in children advocacy projects in the SADC region. During the launch of Child Protection Week last weekend, she detailed how and why Sweden's methods have been beneficial in grooming young minds. Now 25 years into its democracy, South Africa is experiencing escalating school violence, as we've seen with many videos, child abuse and neglect in all 9 provinces. But of course, we've got the ambassador who joins us now to shed some light in terms of how then do we start moving forward and exactly where do we take a leaf out of this booklet there as well. Ambassador, thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight this afternoon. I know that Sweden has actually banned spanking. How the decisions that led up to that, let's talk about it, and also how is Sweden doing as a result of having banned such?
Thank you very much for having me here. Well, I think in Sweden, children's issues became something that was discussed already in the 1960s. And then in 1979, we introduced the prohibition on spanking in schools and in the home. And I would say in the beginning it was probably fairly criticized, not least among parents, a little bit as we've heard before. But the fact is that child abuse has gone down constantly since 1979. And I think there are 2 issues with it. First, I think and that's probably the most important, I mean, children were informed in school about the prohibition. And by that, they were made very aware of that they had rights, that it was their right not to be hit, not to be abused. And I think very often in families with an abuse problem, the child thinks it's their fault.
Yeah.
So having this legislation and having knowledge of it actually encouraged the children, strengthened the children to know this is not right, what I'm being subjected to. So it helped them also to report to a teacher or to another adult that this was happening. Then it started slowly to change the norm in Sweden. I mean, parents that originally would say, this is my decision, I need this to discipline my children.
This is what happens in my household, and you will not dictate to me how my household is run. Yeah.
But eventually the norm changed, and it went fairly quickly. So I think they said after 5 years, there were only 30% of children that would say that they were still being spanked. After another 10 years, it had gone down, and today there are about 5% that say that they are subjected to some physical or spanking. Then proper abuse is another issue.
On the other side of it, though, especially when it comes to the South African context, many educators even and many individuals that have to deal with children on a daily basis and look after children on a daily basis will often complain about how sometimes it's difficult to manage children because they've become unruly. As time has gone on, they become unruly. We've had some horrendous videos that have been gone viral on social media where children are inflicting pain onto each other, and that is a form of violence that is increasing in our schools. In that regard, then, what kind of discipline has been instilled from a Swedish perspective that perhaps South Africa can learn and perhaps even adopt in some instances?
But I think, again, we need to go back to the home. And I think our research in Sweden has shown that with the spanking prohibition, sort of violence in the home went down. And that led to violence going down in the schools as well. And I think all research shows that if you're hit as a child, as a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, that's sort of the discipline you're subjected to, or your father or mother are always sort of using that you will take that with you into school. And I mean, there's a strong correlation between abused children and children that become violent themselves. So I think if we start there, it's not that you need to introduce harsher measures in school. If you start properly at home and have a non-violent environment at home where parents use, as Sonia was saying, you need to talk to them, you have to have positive reinforcement, make them understand why this is not the way out. Then you will have lesser problems in school as well. So I don't think violence is ever the solution to unruly children.
We were talking a little bit earlier on, and you were making, and I mean, I was talking about the reference regards to children within juvenile prisons as a result of having banned corporal punishment in Sweden. Have you seen a spike or a decrease in the amount of children or juvenile children within the prison system in itself?
Well, no, we have quite a low juvenile delinquency. And I mean, there has been sort of a myth going around that Sweden would have a spike because of the spanking prohibition. When we look at figures, I mean, we don't lie over any countries that still don't have sort of a prohibition on corporal punishment. So there's no research that shows that. I can't say exactly with figures where we lie in comparison to Germany or Italy or other countries. But no research has shown that. We keep a very low level on that.
I want us to get practical this afternoon, because I think that a lot of times when we have conversations like this, especially around the protection of children and you know, the banning of corporal punishment, the other side of the coin, and it's just the job really to look at both sides of the story. The other side of the coin would say, but what measures do I instill? If we look at South Africa's economic environment, and we look at the environment in many of the homes, a lot of a portion, I mean, I think about over 50% of South Africans live below the poverty line, and that's the same, something about the nature of the household in itself. Many of the children, I think over 60% of them, come from a single parent headed household, which means that it's a woman who either has to work 2 jobs to sustain a family, and therefore the time to instill and positive reinforcement sometimes is just not there, Ambassador. So in that regard, how then do we start making it practical, even for those homes where they're living below the poverty line, where they come from single parent households, where the environment, the socioeconomic environment, does not make it easy for them to even go into the motion of even instilling positive reinforcement and having that one-on-one conversation?
No, I wish I had a very good piece of advice how you solve all that. I think a lot of it is coordination in society, how you help at all levels. And I'm happy to say we had a delegation from South Africa visiting Sweden beginning of April, coordinated by UNICEF, but with people from the presidency, from the Human Rights Commission, from NGOs, Save the Children and others, to study how we are working with. And I think one conclusion that they brought back with them was the coordination that took place in Sweden, from government level, the parliament, NGOs, social agencies, all actors involved in it, that actually cooperated and coordinated constantly without sort of having any internal conflicts or fights, because everyone had the rights of the child and the interest of the child at the center. And I think that's, well, I can't tell how South Africa needs to do it, but I think it's a good thing to take with you, even on the local level, in the village, in the township, in your municipality. If all the actors that are actually working with the children can coordinate and talk to each other and maybe sit down regularly and talk about the issues, children that are disappearing, how do we help them in school, how do we support the single mothers, how do we get the fathers more engaged, because I think that's another part of the coin. If fathers can become more engaged already from the beginning and help, even if they live separately from the family, it's important for the children to have a father figure that helps them with their development.
Have you found that in the context of Sweden that you've had to really enforce around building a strong family household and a family base that will then translate from the family to the child, and the child in the way in which the child handles themselves? So a strong focus being now on the family unit, and how do we strengthen the family unit so that indeed there can be that conversation in a non-violent household, which then hopefully breeds a non-violent child?
Well, we have, I would say, I mean, we're focusing on the family, but we have lots of single mother households in Sweden or single father households. So what the government and I think what the state has done is to focus on how do we support the family, be it single, double, the same-sex marriage or whatever. So we have, I mean, a very elaborate preschool system. We have a very good child health care system that from the birth of the child follows up the child and can also sort of raise the alarm if they see signs. And they can then help the single mother or the single father or the family that has problems. So I think, again, that's where the government, where the state comes in. If you have a good coordination and you can see the signs, you can help at an early stage.
Yeah, it's also around the policies, and how do you then start enforcing those policies? I mean, you're speaking about, from Sweden's perspective, that, you know, when you first started and you still had the pushback from various parents saying that in my household you will not dictate to me as a state how to run that household, and then over time and gradually as the reinforcement actually took place, then you saw the decline. I want to bring it back into South Africa's context now in terms of how then do you start looking at enforcing some of those policies, because as we know, South Africa is great with policies. We really are champion when it comes to policies, but it's a different thing, isn't it, when it comes to the actual implementation of the policies that have been drafted, because we cannot police every single household ultimately.
No, but there I think the school can play an important role in if the children are aware of their rights. I just heard my Danish colleague tell me, he's a little bit younger than I, and his children were sort of threatening him or spanking him when he was 7 or 8 years old. And his reply to his children was, to his parents was, he came out with a bag and said, I'm moving to Sweden, because there it's forbidden. And I think that's, if the children become aware of that, this is not right, this is against my rights, I think they can be a very important instrument in changing the norms as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just around issues of, you know, positive reinforcement and around decreasing violence. In terms of Sweden's violent statistics, and how is Sweden faring, and how have you managed to get that right?
Well, I think we do fairly well when it comes to juvenile delinquency. We're not without problems. We have violence in our schools as well. So, I mean, it hasn't solved it all, but it's at a lower level than many comparable countries.
Is it a different type of manifestation of violence? In other words, you know, there's the violence where we've seen, especially when it comes to the children themselves, you know, beating each other and punching each other, etc., and even beating and punching the educators in itself. So do you see and find that some schools actually have similar issues?
Yes, I think we have. We have those issues as well. I mean, violence or a threatening environment for the educators. There are places where there are sort of an unsafe environment for the children, and there's abuse between the children, older to younger, and otherwise. So, no, we're not without our challenges, not at all.
However, the positive reinforcement has actually assisted over the last 40 years. I mean, to ban spanking for 40 years and actually see that the country is actually implementing, it says something significant about the human behavior and the human qualities of being able to adopt a positive mantra instead of really heading down the negative trajectory.
And I think other countries, now there are 54 other countries that have introduced the same prohibition on spanking, and I understand there's another 50 having it sort of in the process. Yeah. So we must have done something right, as others are following.
Well, definitely. I must say that if anything Sweden is to go by, I think that it's just looking at how to mitigate against those statistics, and also looking at violence, where you positive reinforcement in the home automatically has got that happier, healthier child, hopefully, as we can. But Ambassador, we have to leave our conversation there. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Afternoon. Shedding some light, really, as we wrap up Child Protection Week. It's all about the interest of the child, and we have had the Swedish Ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Cecilia Julin, who was speaking